So this is a class in the algebra of knots. I mean, it says algebra and knots, but really it's the intersection of those two ideas that I'm most interested in. What I'm interested in as a goal for the course is for us to understand sort of, first of all, what is algebraic thinking and reasoning beyond the standard curriculum that we teach in K-12, right? What does it look like? And how do algebraic questions and answers and structures arise out of the study of knots? And knots are literally what you think they are, right? They are strings or ropes or cords or whatever that are sort of tied together in some sort of way, right? And the fact that algebraic structures can arise out of studying those kinds of objects, to me, is just super cool. And it also is one of these, as I was saying, a low floor activity to sort of begin to introduce to sort of less mathematically seasoned audiences what it means to find familiar algebra from unfamiliar places. So that's the overarching goal for the course. Because this is a course that is part of our Master of Arts in Teaching program, I also want a major component of the course for you to be thinking about and working on how do I take the ideas that we're talking about here and bring them into my classroom? How can my 7th graders, how can my 10th graders benefit from thinking about algebra in the ways that we're thinking about algebra in our course. And so the project that I have in mind for you this semester is to be able to work with one or two other of your classmates in designing a lesson plan that can introduce students at your grade level to one of our knot-like objects. And the three sort of different types of knot-like objects we'll be studying are called braids and tangles and knots and links. So those are the three types. So that'll, I think, divide us into 3 groups, and each group will take one of those areas and say, how can I bring this into my classrooms sort of as a lesson plan and kind of show how it aligns with algebraic reasoning in ways that also are aligned with the Common Core state standards, both the content standards in mathematics and then also the standards for mathematical practice. So those are the main goals, right? We're going to sort of go down a long algebraic and not theoretic rabbit trail together, and I want us to be thinking constantly along that trail about what could this mean for my students in my classroom. Let me talk through the learning outcomes, the more specific outcomes of the course. This is going to sound like a long list, but it's also a long semester. It already feels like the semester has lasted forever. We're only a week in. Maybe that's just me. But here are the set of outcomes. The first topic area is the topic on braids. And so in this topic, this is going to be kind of our introductory topic. This is where we study some very simple algebraic structures, starting today in thinking about anagrams and permutations, and then expanding that out to think about braids and how braids themselves form an algebraic structure called a braid group. And to be able to do algebra inside of those structures. And anytime I say the words simplify and solve, that sounds an awful lot like algebra. So that's something we'll talk more about today. So these are the 3 sort of specific outcomes that are a part of the permutations and braids topic area. The second area is rational tangles. Rational tangles are another knot-like object that are similar to braids, except they kind of have an extra twisty dimension to them. And so that's the first area where we're going to be able to have an algebraic structure on the one hand that completely sort of faithfully represents the algebraic structure of rational tangles on the other hand, that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the algebraic reality and the sort of reality that's on the table in front of you in tangled up string form. And so the top of that mountain is to understand the complete invariance property of the tangle number of a rational tangle and everything that sort of is along the way to that. Rational tangles also happens to be the most popular inroad for math teachers and math teacher educators into this topic area. There's a great activity we're going to do in our next class on Monday called the Rational Tangle Dance, which is unfortunately a lot better in person than it is going to be in remote learning, but I'm going to try to do my best with it. But there's a great sort of math teachers circle set of activities that practicing teachers do around this topic. That's a great introduction and also is, again, really low floor and engaging for students as well. Then we get to the actual meat and potatoes of knots. So the tangles and braids are sort of, they get us thinking about knot-like questions, but then we want to arrive in thinking about knots themselves as geometric objects, as topological objects, how they're related to braids and tangles. And then kind of the most important idea that we have in knots is thinking about what are called knot invariants. A knot invariant is any property that can adequately tell the difference between two knots, and also be able to tell us when two knots are the same, right? And some invariants are better at doing that than others. And so what our knots search is going to feel like is it's going to feel like a search for the best possible invariant, the most powerful way to tell for sure whether one knot that you give me and another knot that someone else gives me are the same knot or not, right? The other hard thing about teaching knots is that the word knot with a K and the word knot without a K sound exactly the same. I will probably make as many jokes about that as I can over the course of the semester, so fair warning. This is also the area where we're going to get a chance to taste some algebra that's a little bit beyond the K-12 realm, but also might be familiar. So we're going to use linear algebra in some places to answer questions about knots. We'll see some polynomials showing up here that are invariants for knots. And then the sort of the top of the mountain here is an algebraic structure called a quandle, which is also a fun word. And that's going to be the structure that has the complete power to classify knots, that two different knots will have different quandles, and two different quandles will necessarily represent different knots. And every other invariant that we meet along the way is going to be a little bit less powerful, a little bit weaker, and actually can be derived from the fundamental quandle at the end of the day. So we have we're going to spend a lot of time talking about knots and the various invariants that are there. And then the last set of outcomes that I have are related to the practical theory to practice connections that I'm hoping we'll be able to make together to your practice in the classroom. So in the project that you'll be working on, I'm going to be asking you to be able to discuss, again, the nature and the prevalence of algebraic reasoning that happens beyond the traditional K-12 curriculum. Ask you to draw explicit connections between the knots and algebra stuff that we're talking about with the content areas of the Common Core state standards for a selected grade level. So I'm going to try to get you together into groups of fellow educators teaching at the same roughly grade level so that you can think together about, well, how do 7th graders think about these, or how do my 10th graders think about these? And so when it says for a selected grade level, that's going to be for the grade level that you teach, or that you're used, that you teach most of the time if you have bounced around a little bit. So explicit connections to the content of the Common Core, explicit connections with the standards of mathematical practice in the Common Core, and then to design that grade level appropriate lesson plan that tries to hit all three of those points in ways that are appropriate for the audience that you would be teaching them to. So those are I got to count them now, 3, 6, 11, 15. So there's 15 of these different standards that I kind of see as the main outcomes for the course. As far as where our instructional material comes from, I'm going to be sharing all of it just as websites with some selections. There's a few things that I'm going to try to draw from a not open source resource, and it's going to mainly be this material on quandles. What I'll probably end up doing most of the time is just writing my own version of that stuff and sharing it out on our sort of class textbook open resource, which is this Open Algebra and Knots site that I shared with you a little bit earlier on. I don't think you can quite see the top of the page on my screen here. Let me switch back to, here we go, Open Algebra and Knots. So I have a version of it from the last time I taught this course that was organized a little bit differently. I'm kind of rearranging it into a new fashion for this semester. And so that's the Open Algebra and Knots redo. It's the Red Oak edition. And so as we go along, that material will all be here as we go. And so right now, in our first week, we just have this first section available on anagram algebra. But as we go along through the semester, more stuff will be posted. This will kind of be the central hub for the reading material for the course, will be this site. Let me talk a little bit about mastery grading, and then that'll wrap up our syllabus conversation, modulo your questions. So I do grade on a standards-based approach. And if you're familiar with that from K-12 setting, then you'll know kind of what I'm about to talk about. If you're not, this might blow your mind a little bit. Traditional grading, the way that I would say most math teachers and professors grade, right, is you grade on the basis of performance on individual assignments, right? 70% on quiz 1 and 80% on quiz 2. And then you take all of those data points and you average them in some way over the semester, and that average is kind of an average performance over the course of the semester is what determines your grade. Standards-based grading kind of turns that on its head a little bit, and it says instead of focusing on the performance tasks as the source of your course grade, it says we want your course grade to more purely reflect your mastery of the learning outcomes of the course. So these 15 different things. The number of these 15 different things that you're able to demonstrate that you have proficiency in by the time the semester is over, that number determines your grade. And regardless of what different types of assessments that might happen on, and regardless of how many times it might take you to revise and improve upon your previous work, that we hold all of that previous work harmless until you have mastered or demonstrated proficiency in each of these areas. So it's a very much a revise and resubmit kind of philosophy to learning and to grading. And so what sort of how I explain this, right, is that the ink isn't really dry on any of your grades in the course until the semester is over. Anytime you work on something and I get a chance to look at it, I give you feedback. So this is ideally a very feedback-rich environment. Every time I give you feedback, if your work doesn't quite rise to the level where I can say, yes, you've demonstrated proficiency on this topic, right? I'll give you suggestions to improve. You improve upon it. I look at it again, give you more feedback if you need it, until each of those areas is demonstrated proficient, right? And so, that means that there's no such thing as bombing a test, really, in a standards-based philosophy. There's no bad grades, there's just kind of not yet grades, and then opportunities to revise and resubmit. I like this for a lot of reasons. One reason is that I feel like everyone sort of picks up and absorbs new mathematics at different rates, and so I want to give space for people to get stuff, not perfect the first time, and not suffer in their grade for it. I don't care when you learn something over the course of the semester as much as I care that you learn it by the time the semester is over. So that process of, sharing your work with me, getting my feedback on it, improving on it, reassessing and seeing where you're at, that's kind of the workflow that I want to have. I also adopted OneNote for us for this semester because I think logistically it gives us a lot easier way to do that, because it gives us these folders that you and I can always look at and share, and you can always be updating, and we can always be in conversation right there inside of your folders, as opposed to Blackboard or other LMSs, Schoology, Moodle, anything, right, where you're submitting an assignment that then is sort of lost to you until I grade it, and then it comes back to you, and that's the end of the story. I'm interested more in conversation than I am in evaluation, if that makes sense. So what that also means is that I have to do a little bit more work anytime I give you a task to work on, to kind of tell you, this is the learning standard, this is the outcome, or possibly multiple outcomes that this task is related to. And that as you do work on this and get my feedback on it, what I'm hoping you'll be doing is building out a portfolio of your work over the course of the semester, so that you can kind of look in your portfolio and say, well, how do I know? How have I demonstrated that that I'm proficient in this standard? Well, here's some work that I did that I got good feedback on and I think is all set, right? So there's also that sort of reflective aspect to it, that you're saying, here's how my work relates to the outcomes of the course. And so that's it. I'm not planning on giving any high stakes assessments for us. That's not really how I operate for master's level courses for our MAT program. So most of what I give you will be homework to work on, activities to work on, like the one that I'll give you between now and Monday's class to work on, and that kind of stuff. So that's what to look forward to. When I do give you a feedback mark on it, I kind of have two different marks that show that you are sort of proficient. There's an S for satisfactory. There's an E for exemplary. Those don't count any differently in the mastery scheme, but I wanted to have a little bit of something extra to recognize truly sort of exceptional work over and above sort of what my expectations for proficiency were. So E and S both mean you got the credit for this. That standard has been mastered. And the no credit marks are a P for progressing, or an N for I can't even really tell based on your work if you are on the road yet or not. And each of those comes with it an opportunity to then revise and to resubmit your work. So that's how it works. With my lower level students, the other class I'm teaching this semester is a business calculus class. And so for them, I have a fancy grade sheet that sort of keeps track of all these things and gives them a little thermometer to show their progress toward each of the letter grades in the course. I may end up setting up something like that for us in this section as well. I haven't really decided yet I might do it later on this week now that the drop add period is over. But as far as letter grades go, basically the... did I miscount my content standards? Maybe it is 16 instead of 15. But you finished with an A in the course if you get at least 9 of the 12 content standards to proficiency and at least 3 of the 4 practical standards. And again, the practical standards are assessed through the project. The content standards are assessed through everything else that we do in the course and can also be assessed as part of the project as well. So if your team decides to do a project on braids or something like that, you can use the work that you're doing in the braids area to count towards your braid content mastery as well as the project mastery if you wish, right? If that's needed for you. But chances are, if you're already thinking so much about braids as part of the project, you probably also have demonstrated mastery of the content standards, but I want there to be that flexibility. And so for each of these final grades, there's a minimum content standard and a minimum practical standard. If you hit one of these and not the other, that's where the half grades in between come in. And this also can kind of give you something to aim for over the course of the semester, and anytime you're sort of interested in how you're doing with your progress, something to talk with me about. One of the downsides to standards-based grading is that it doesn't give students a day-to-day snapshot of what their average letter grade is in the course. There's only just sort of progress towards a letter grade. So anytime you have those kinds of questions, just let me know. We can talk through it, look at the work that you've done, and kind of I can take my best educated guess at where you'll end up based on the progress you've made thus far. It's pretty common in a standards-based grading system that people master more standards quicker toward the end of the semester than they do toward the beginning, just because you've had more opportunities to revise as the semester gets on a little bit longer. So if it feels like progress starts out a little bit slow, that's normal for this kind of grading system. That's the trade-off of then being able to continue revising things up until the end of the semester.